the Puritan era. Charles Dickens, no, not a Puritan, not the Puritan era, famously opened up one of his books with this line. You probably know this line. You may not have read the book, A Tale of Two Cities, but this was the line, or the line. It says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair." Now, Dickens is writing that with reference to the time of the French Revolution, but I really think that encapsulates what we're going to discover and journey together tonight in the 1600s of England and the life and times of a man like John Owen. He's born in 1616. So if you're thinking about the Puritan century, as it's often spoken about, those dates are loosely, but somewhere in the vicinity of 1560 to 1660. Now, those dates kind of wrap around two major rulers of England and the United Kingdom. Firstly, Queen Elizabeth, who takes over from Mary, her half-sister or stepsister, half-sister. And Mary was a fairly fierce persecutor of Protestants. She lit up Smithfield, a province in England, with many stakes, burning these Protestants at the stake for their heresy. In fact, Queen Mary was once asked, "Why do you take the Protestants and burn them with fire to kill them?" She said, "I execute them and I do God's work." She went on to say, this is pretty grim, she said, "If God's going to burn these heretics forever in hell, why shouldn't I burn them temporarily here on earth?" And she really thought that that was her main calling as a Catholic sympathizer and someone who was passionately against the Protestant, the evangelical faith. So when Elizabeth comes to the throne, she's known as the moderator, the moderating queen. She very much kind of stilled hostilities, I should say, between Catholics and the Protestants. And in that era, it brought about what we know now as the Puritans. So 1560 and 1660 is when Charles II is returning, because Charles I has been beheaded already by the Parliament in the English Civil War. Charles II returns, another very fierce and staunch Catholic sympathizer, probably an outright Catholic actually, and that ends the Puritan era. So when you hear the word Puritan used, and you probably will, you'll hear Puritan used for all kinds of people of history, and oftentimes the word is used maybe illegitimately. Like, you ever heard Charles Spurgeon called a Puritan? He only missed the Puritan century by about 2 centuries, right? But people still love to put him right there in that Puritan era. Or sometimes people call Jonathan Edwards a Puritan. Edwards' theology was puritanical for sure, but he's born in 1703, so he misses the Puritan era. And he's born on the wrong continent. He's, of course, born in North America in the colonies. So we're really describing, when we think about Puritans, if you want a really strict and exact way of understanding it, it's English nonconformists, so not Scottish, not even necessarily those Scots that were in Ireland, and not those that are in the colonies. It's people that are English, non-conforming, between 1560 and 1660. Now, this is really important, because the 17th century had huge tidal swings of political and religious thought in Puritan England. Carl Trueman, one of the best historians and theologians of our era, appropriately calls this century the most turbulent of all of English history. Centuries and eras, this is part of what Trueman will say, centuries and eras and times create their own men. So have you ever wondered to yourself, how is it that we have these Puritans, these kind of theological juggernauts that all seem to kind of be congregated around the same time frame? How is it they're kind of all born around the same time and lived and ministered under the same conditions? Part of the explanation for that will be the times themselves will often create the type of leaders and men and characters on the scene of history. So each era or each period will be defined by kind of what big question they're trying to answer. So if we go back a century to the 16th century, that's the 1500s, we think about guys like Luther and guys like Calvin and even John Knox. The big question that they were trying to answer is this, I'm getting this from Trueman: how can God be gracious to a sinner like me? So that's the way they ministered, that's the way they thought, that's the way they wrote, that's the way they lived their lives, with this deep conviction that a reconciliation between a holy God and an unholy sinner like me, that reconciliation needs to be made. How is that happening? Now, to most of us in this room, That's a fairly straightforward and simple answer to offer, but it wasn't in the 1500s. This precipitated the Reformation itself. People began to question the sacramentology of Romanism and the way that Catholics had set up their entire church system. They began to challenge that, and of course the Reformation is the result. But in the 17th century, i.e. the Puritans, they were more asking the question, what should worship look like? So understanding the gospel, like we're reconciled back to God through the mediating work of Christ. But then the question is, what now? Like it's not like the gospel is settled and we move on from it. The Puritans aren't arguing that, but they are saying that once you've settled in your heart a conviction that your sins are forgiven, you've been justified by grace through faith, you're in right standing with God, what does your life look like? And more specifically, what does the church look like? How does the church govern itself? How does it operate? How does it think about things like baptism and the Lord's Supper and church discipline and the liturgy of preaching and psalms and hymns and spiritual songs? How does all of this happen? And if you study church history, and of course I recommend the discipline to all of you, you will notice that all of those things that maybe take part in our Sunday worship services in churches that we congregate in, you'll notice that each one of those components of the worship service was not just deeply controversial at some point in fairly recent history, but was something that people went to outright war over and people died. Like people actually died. To baptize someone, people were drowned on the continent. That's what they did to those early Anabaptists. They drowned them to death because they began to challenge the validity of infant baptism, what they called an extension of Catholic baptism. And I'm a proud Baptist, so I kind of identify, not with the Anabaptists as far as lineage, but at least the conviction that infant baptism isn't the New Testament principle. I apologize to my pedo Baptists in the room. But this is just, coming from me. When I look at that, I think about, well, there's a clear example of people dying for something that today doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. Or, well, there really wasn't any major kerfuffle quite as large as the dispute and the outright war and bloodshed around the Lord's table. What is the Lord's table? Is the Lord's table a re-sacrifice of Christ, or is it a memorial offering? Is it some kind of a hybrid? How is Jesus present? Is he physically and actually present in the bread and in the wine, or is his body and blood physically conveyed through the bread and wine? That would be consubstantiation as opposed to transubstantiation. Then you've got Calvin and Zwingli. We can go into this all night. We could spend a lot of time on all of these intricacies of theology. But in the 1600s, these became really big questions that challenged what it meant to be a Christian. So this would be, as thinking about the Puritan era, this would be what J.I. Packer might call a tour of the Redwoods. Now, if you've never read J.I. Packer on the Puritans, I would encourage you to get the resource called A Quest for Godliness. A Quest for Godliness. A wonderful, rich study that Packer put together. It's J.I. Packer, is a profound theologian, actually passed away just a few years ago, but he wrote this wonderful resource on the Puritans. And he would say that the Puritans are the redwoods. Now that's a reference, of course, because the tallest species of tree in the world are the redwoods of the American Pacific coast. Some of them standing as tall as 85 meters high, reaching a width of 11.1 meters. Now to give that context, because that's just a number, an average telegraph pole around here is 10 meters high. We're talking about trees that reach 85 meters high and over 10 meters in width, in diameter. Now these behemoths, these redwoods, dwarfed anyone who stands at their base and looks upward at their proud height. So it can be a really humbling experience to stand at the base of a redwood and just look up and think this tree goes forever. That's almost the impression that you get. So as I said, J.I. Packer has described the Puritans as the theological redwoods of church history.